I pulled into my driveway after 8 days away, bone tired from the drive back from Houston. My brother Danny had a triple bypass surgery, and I'd stayed through the worst of it, sleeping in hospital chairs and living off vending machine coffee. He was recovering now, thank God, but all I wanted was to get home to my wife, Linda. She'd had a stroke 14 months ago, and while she'd recovered most of her mobility, her speech was still slow, and her memory wasn't what it used to be. 8 days felt like forever. The porch light was off. That was strange. Linda always left it on, said she didn't like coming home to a dark house. I grabbed my duffel bag from the back seat and walked up the path, fumbling for my keys. That's when I heard it, a weak thumping sound, irregular, desperate, coming from somewhere inside. My stomach dropped. I jammed the key in the lock and pushed the door open. The smell hit me first, something sour and wrong. The thumping was louder now, coming from the garage, from the storage room we'd converted years ago when the kids were small. I dropped my bag and ran. The door to the storage room had a padlock on it, a padlock I'd never seen before in my life. The thumping stopped, then started again, weaker. "Linda?" I shouted. A muffled cry, a voice I'd know anywhere, even through a door. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the hammer from under the sink, and beat that lock until it broke. The door swung open, and I nearly fell over from the stench. Urine, sweat. Something rotten. Linda was on the floor in the corner, curled up on a pile of old blankets. She was wearing the same nightgown she'd had on when I left 8 days ago. Her face was hollow, her lips cracked and bleeding. There was a bucket nearby that I couldn't look at. Empty water bottles scattered around her. But not many. Not enough for 8 days. She looked up at me with eyes that took a moment to focus. "Richard?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Richard, is that you?" I was on my knees beside her in seconds, pulling her into my arms. She weighed nothing. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here. I've got you." She started crying, these weak, broken sobs that shattered something inside me. I carried her to the living room and laid her on the couch, then called 911 with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. As I gave the dispatcher our address, I looked around. Things were different. The china cabinet in the dining room was empty. Linda's jewelry box, the one that sat on the hallway table, was gone. The gun safe in the corner of the living room, the one where I kept my father's hunting rifles, stood open and empty. The paramedics arrived in 7 minutes. They checked her vitals, started an IV, asked me questions I couldn't answer. "Sir, when did you last see your wife?" 8 days ago. I left her with our son. Brandon was supposed to stay with her while I was in Houston. My brother had surgery. The paramedic exchanged a look with his partner, the kind of look that made my blood run cold. They loaded Linda into the ambulance. I rode with her, holding her hand, telling her she was safe, telling her I was sorry. So sorry I'd ever left. At Memorial Hospital, they admitted her immediately. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, early signs of kidney failure. The doctor, a young woman with tired eyes, pulled me aside. "Mr. Dawson, your wife has been without adequate food or water for what appears to be close to a week, maybe longer. She's lucky to be alive." I couldn't speak, couldn't process what she was saying. A police officer arrived an hour later. Detective Angela Reyes, Phoenix PD Elder Abuse Unit. I didn't even know Phoenix had an elder abuse unit. I sat in the hospital waiting room and told her everything. "My name is Richard Dawson. I'm 67 years old, retired from 30 years with the Maricopa County Fire Department. My wife, Linda, is 64. She had a stroke 14 months ago. It affected her speech and her short-term memory, but she can still do most things with a little help. She knows who I am. She knows our son. She just needs reminders sometimes. Gets confused if her routine changes. Our son Brandon is 41. He works in real estate, or at least he says he does. His wife Melissa is 38. She used to work at a mortgage company but quit a few years back to focus on Brandon's business. I never understood exactly what that business was. He talked a lot about flipping houses, investment properties, passive income. I stopped asking for details when it became clear he didn't like the questions. 8 days ago, my brother Danny in Houston had a heart attack that led to emergency bypass surgery. I booked the first flight out. Brandon volunteered immediately. "Dad, don't even think about it," he'd said. "I'll stay with Mom. You just go take care of Uncle Danny." I was relieved. Brandon knew his mother's medication schedule, knew her routines, knew how to handle the confusion when it happened. He'd been helpful since her stroke, visiting more often, offering to run errands. I thought he'd finally grown up, finally become the man I'd hoped he'd be. I called every day from Houston. "The first 4 days," Brandon answered. "Mom's doing great, Dad. We watched her shows. Melissa made her favorite pot roast. Don't worry about a thing." But starting day 5, the calls went to voicemail. He texted instead, "Busy with Mom. She's napping. Call you later." But he never did. I tried calling Linda directly. Her phone went to voicemail every time. I told myself Brandon was just busy. I told myself they had it handled. I stayed in Houston because Danny needed me. That was my mistake. Detective Reyes listened to everything, took notes, then asked the question that made my heart stop. "Mr. Dawson, during those 8 days, did you give your son power of attorney over your wife's finances or medical decisions?" "No, absolutely not." "Did your wife sign any documents that you're aware of?" "She can barely sign her own name since the stroke. Her right side was affected." "Why are you asking me this?" She closed her notebook. "We need to investigate further. But Mr. Dawson, this looks like more than neglect. I'll be in touch." Linda stayed in the hospital for 4 days. They pumped fluids into her, treated her kidney function, monitored her heart. The stroke damage made her recovery slower than it should have been. She kept asking about Brandon. "Where's Brandon? Is he coming to visit? He was just here. He was making me dinner." "No, sweetheart, he wasn't." On the 3rd day, while Linda was sleeping, I went home to look more carefully, to try to understand what had happened in my house while I was gone. What I found made me want to put my fist through a wall. The storage room door had been padlocked from the outside. Inside, I found that bucket, those few water bottles, a pile of old blankets on the concrete floor. The light bulb had been removed from the socket. My wife, who sometimes forgets what she had for breakfast, but who still laughs at my terrible jokes and cheers for the Diamondbacks every summer, had been locked in darkness for more than a week. I searched the rest of the house. Brandon had taken things, obvious things. Linda's jewelry, including her mother's diamond ring, the one that had been in her family for 3 generations. My father's rifles from the gun safe, worth maybe $15,000 total to the right collector. The silverware from the china cabinet. But that wasn't the worst of it. I went to my office and checked the files I keep in my desk. The lockbox where I store important documents was open, the lock broken. I searched through what was left. The deed to our house was missing. I logged into our bank accounts. The joint checking account, the one we use for bills and groceries, had been drained. $4,000. Gone. The savings account, the one we'd built over 30 years of marriage, the one meant to cover Linda's medical costs as she aged, showed a withdrawal of $62,000. $62,000. Transferred to an account I didn't recognize. I called our credit union immediately. The representative was apologetic but firm. "Mr. Dawson, the withdrawal was authorized with your wife's signature and a valid power of attorney document. We verified her identity with her driver's license and social security number. I never signed a power of attorney." "Sir, we have the document on file. It's dated 6 days ago. Your wife's signature is on it, along with yours as witness." My signature was forged. My wife can barely hold a pen. "I'm sorry, sir. You'll need to file a police report and dispute the transaction." "But the money has already been moved." I hung up and sat there, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of what my son had done. I called Detective Reyes and told her everything. She came to the house with 2 other officers. I showed them the storage room, the empty gun safe, the bank statements, the missing deed. She made calls. Within the hour, officers were dispatched to Brandon and Melissa's apartment in Scottsdale. They weren't there. The apartment was half empty, furniture gone, closets cleaned out. But in the kitchen trash, the officers found something crucial: bank statements from an account in the Cayman Islands, printouts of flight itineraries, A receipt from a jewelry store in Tucson, dated 3 days after I left for Houston. They'd sold Linda's mother's ring for $12,000. They'd planned this. They'd waited for me to leave, locked my wife in a storage room so she couldn't call anyone or tell anyone what was happening, and systematically stolen everything we had. Then they'd planned to disappear. If Danny's recovery hadn't gone better than expected, if I hadn't come home 2 days early, Linda would have died in that storage room. Brandon and Melissa would have found her body, played the grieving son, and been on a plane to somewhere without extradition before the funeral. Detective Reyes was blunt about it. Your early return saved your wife's life. I couldn't respond. I just sat there, thinking about the little boy I'd taught to ride a bike, the teenager I'd coached in Little League, the young man who'd cried at his mother's hospital bed after her stroke, holding her hand and promising to take care of her. That person didn't exist anymore. Maybe he never had. The manhunt began. Phoenix PD issued warrants for Brandon and Melissa. Their faces were on the local news within 24 hours. Son and daughter-in-law wanted in elder abuse case. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters, neighbors, old colleagues from the fire department. I ignored all of it. My focus was Linda. She came home from the hospital on day 5. Physically, she was recovering. Her kidneys were functioning again. She was eating solid food, but mentally, she was worse than before. The trauma, the confusion, the abandonment had done something to her. She kept asking where Brandon was, kept insisting he'd just been there, that he'd been taking care of her. I couldn't tell her the truth. How do you explain to a woman whose memory is already fragile that her own son left her to die? On day 7, Brandon and Melissa were arrested at Los Angeles International Airport. They'd tried to board a flight to Mexico City, the first leg of their journey to Costa Rica, where they'd apparently already put a down payment on a beachfront property with the money they'd stolen from us. Detective Reyes called me within the hour. We have them. They're in custody. I felt nothing. No relief. No satisfaction. Just a cold, heavy emptiness. The charges came fast. 2 counts of elder abuse, 2 counts of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, 2 counts of unlawful confinement, 2 counts of fraud, 1 count of forgery for the power of attorney document, 1 count of attempted murder. That last charge, that was the one the prosecutor added after consulting with the medical team. The doctor's report stated that Linda was within 12 to 24 hours of fatal kidney failure when I found her. If I'd come home 1 day later, she would have died. Brandon and Melissa had left her with just enough water bottles to survive maybe 4 or 5 days, betting that I'd stay in Houston for the full 2 weeks Danny's doctor had initially predicted. They hadn't meant to save her. They'd meant to kill her slowly, with plausible deniability. The arraignment was held 2 weeks after their arrest. I sat in the back of the courtroom and watched my son in an orange jumpsuit, looking thinner than I remembered, looking scared. Melissa sat next to him, her lawyer whispering in her ear. Brandon's lawyer argued for bail. No prior criminal record. Ties to the community. Low flight risk. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Diane Hartley, argued the opposite. They were caught at an airport with one-way tickets. They had foreign bank accounts. They had left a vulnerable woman to die. The judge denied bail. Brandon and Melissa would remain in custody at the Maricopa County Jail until trial. As the deputies let him out, Brandon looked at me. His eyes were wet. "Dad," he mouthed, "I'm sorry. Please." I stood up and walked out. I couldn't look at him. The criminal case moved forward, but I wasn't satisfied waiting for the courts. I hired a lawyer named Patricia Okonkwo, a partner at a firm specializing in elder law. Her advice was direct. "Richard, you have grounds for a civil suit. Sue them for everything they took, plus damages for what Linda endured. Even if they don't have assets now, we can put liens on any future income, inheritance, anything. Lock it down." I filed suit 3 weeks later. Brandon Dawson and Melissa Dawson, defendants. Financial exploitation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, damages sought, $66,000 in stolen funds, plus $300,000 in additional damages for Linda's suffering and medical costs. We also went after the credit union. They'd accepted a clearly forged signature without proper verification. They'd allowed a power of attorney to be used without confirming it with me or with Linda's physician. Their negligence had enabled the theft. The credit union settled out of court 4 months later. They returned the $62,000 to our savings account and paid an additional $40,000 in damages. They didn't admit wrongdoing, but they didn't fight either. Their legal team knew they'd lose in front of a jury. That was something, at least. We got most of the money back, but the other thefts, the jewelry, the rifles, the cash from checking, that was gone. Brandon and Melissa had already spent it or hidden it offshore. The months that followed were a blur. Linda's condition worsened. Stress and trauma accelerate cognitive decline, her neurologist told me. She stopped asking about Brandon, which somehow felt worse than the questions. It was like her brain had erased him as a defense mechanism. I hired a part-time caregiver to help with Linda while I dealt with the legal proceedings. Maria was a godsend, patient and kind, everything my son should have been. The preliminary hearing happened in January, 5 months after I'd found Linda in that storage room. I testified. I walked the court through every detail, the locked door, the smell, the empty water bottles, the forged documents. Brandon's lawyer tried to argue that Melissa had been the mastermind, that Brandon had been manipulated, that he'd never intended for his mother to be harmed. Prosecutor Hartley destroyed that argument with a single piece of evidence. Text messages between Brandon and Melissa from day 3. Melissa, your mom keeps crying. She keeps trying to get out. This is stressing me out. Brandon, she'll forget. Just give it another day. Her memory's shot anyway. She won't remember any of this. Melissa, what if she dies in there? Brandon, then we make it look like she wandered in and got stuck. Dad won't question it. He'll be too upset to think straight. The courtroom was silent when the prosecutor read those messages aloud. The judge bound the case over for trial. Trial date set for June. But before the trial, Melissa's lawyer approached the prosecutor with a deal. Melissa would plead guilty to all charges except attempted murder and testify against Brandon in exchange for a reduced sentence. She'd tell the court that Brandon had planned everything, that he'd convinced her to go along with it, that she'd wanted to back out but he'd threatened her. Prosecutor Hartley called me to discuss it. If Melissa testifies, we have an airtight case against Brandon. Her testimony, plus the evidence, guarantees conviction on all charges, including attempted murder. Will she serve time? I asked. Yes. We're recommending 10 years, with parole eligibility after 6. And Brandon, with Melissa's testimony and the text messages, we're pushing for 25 to life. Attempted murder of a vulnerable adult is a Class 2 felony in Arizona. Combined with the other charges, he's looking at serious time. I thought about Linda, asking where her son was. I thought about those water bottles, not enough to survive on. I thought about the text. She'll forget. Take the deal, I said. Melissa pleaded guilty in March. Her sentencing hearing was brief. She cried. She said she was sorry. The judge was unmoved. Miss Dawson, you participated in a scheme that left a vulnerable woman to die alone in a locked room. You chose money over human life. 10 years in state prison. Brandon's trial began in June. It lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution presented everything. The forged POA, the bank records, the storage room, the text messages, the flight itineraries to Costa Rica. Linda was called to testify. That was the hardest day of my life. My wife sat in that witness chair, confused and scared, trying to explain what she remembered. Fragments, being in the dark, being thirsty, hearing the door lock, crying for Brandon, waiting for someone to come. Brandon's lawyer tried to use her confusion to discredit her testimony. Mrs. Dawson, you can't really remember what happened, can you? Your memory isn't reliable. Linda looked at him with surprising clarity. I remember being scared. I remember being alone. I remember thinking I was going to die in there. The courtroom was silent. Then the prosecution played the photos. The storage room as police had found it. The bucket. The blankets. The scratches on the inside of the door where Linda had tried to claw her way out. 2 jurors started crying. Melissa testified next. She laid out the entire plan. How Brandon had suggested it months before my trip to Houston. How he'd researched power of attorney laws. How he'd found a notary who worked out of a strip mall and didn't ask questions. How he'd timed everything around my brother's surgery. It was his idea, she said. All of it. I just went along with what he told me. Brandon took the stand in his own defense. His lawyer tried to paint him as a desperate man, facing financial ruin, pressured by his wife. He claimed he never meant for his mother to be hurt. He claimed he'd planned to let her out before anything bad happened. The prosecutor destroyed him. Mr. Dawson, you wrote to your wife, quote, "If she dies, we make it look like she wandered in and got stuck," end quote. Is that what someone writes when they never meant for their mother to be hurt? That was taken out of context. What context makes that acceptable, Mr. Dawson? Brandon had no answer. Deliberations took 3 hours, guilty on all counts. Sentencing was 2 months later. I submitted a victim impact statement, 6 pages. Everything this had done to Linda, to me, to our lives, the nightmares, the medical costs, the therapy, the way Linda flinches now when she hears a door lock, the way she sometimes wakes up screaming, thinking she's back in that room. Linda couldn't write her own statement, so her neurologist submitted a letter documenting how the trauma had accelerated her cognitive decline. She'd lost 2 years of function in 8 days. The judge read everything. Then she looked at Brandon. "Mr. Dawson, you are not a child. You are a 41-year-old man who planned and executed a scheme to steal from your parents and murder your mother. You exploited her vulnerability. You left her to die in darkness. You then attempted to flee the country with the money. This court finds no mitigating factors. Brandon Dawson, you are sentenced to 28 years in the Arizona State Prison. You will be eligible for parole after serving 85% of your sentence." I did the math. 24 years minimum before he'd even be considered for release. He'd be 65 years old. I'd likely be dead by then. Linda certainly would be. I walked out of that courtroom and sat in my truck for an hour, not moving. It was over, but it wasn't. Not really. The civil suit settled a month later. Brandon and Melissa were jointly liable for $350,000. Of course, they don't have that money. The court put liens on any future assets. If they ever inherit anything, earn anything, own anything, it belongs to us first. Linda and I are still in our house. The credit union settlement covered most of her medical costs for now, but her care needs are increasing. The stroke damage combined with the trauma has accelerated everything. I'm looking at maybe 2 more years before she'll need full-time memory care. When that happens, I'll probably have to sell the house. Brandon is at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence, about an hour south of Phoenix. Melissa is at Perryville, the women's facility. I haven't visited either of them. I won't. People ask me sometimes if I regret pressing charges so hard. If I think 28 years was too harsh for my own son. Here's what I tell them. Brandon locked his confused, scared mother in a storage room for 8 days. He left her with barely enough water to survive, betting that she'd die before I came home. He stole our life savings. He forged documents. He planned to flee the country and never look back. And when Melissa asked what they'd do if his mother died in there, he said they'd make it look like an accident. 28 years isn't too harsh. It's justice. Linda doesn't understand where Brandon is. Sometimes she asks about him, but less and less now. I tell her he moved away for work. It's easier than explaining the truth to someone who won't remember the explanation anyway. Last week, Linda forgot our wedding anniversary for the first time in 41 years. She looked at the flowers I'd brought home and asked who they were from. When I told her they were from me, she smiled and said that was very thoughtful for a neighbor to do. It took her 20 minutes to remember that I was her husband. I think about that sometimes. How Brandon didn't just steal our money. He stole our time. The time Linda and I had left before her mind goes completely. Those 8 days in that storage room, and all the days since that have been consumed by trauma and doctors and lawyers and court dates, those are gone forever. That's what I can't forgive. The money can be replaced. The house can be sold. But those days with my wife, watching her decline faster than she should have, knowing that my own son did this to her, that's a wound that won't heal. So, no, I don't regret the 28 years. I'd do it again. Someone asked me recently if I have any advice for other parents. I thought about it for a long time. Watch for the warning signs, I finally said. Brandon borrowed money from us 3 times in the years before this happened. Small amounts. A few thousand here and there. He always had an excuse. Business deals that fell through. Investments that didn't pan out. I never pushed. I never asked hard questions. I just wanted to believe my son was doing okay. I should have asked. I should have seen who he was becoming. But also, don't blame yourself. Because at the end of the day, Brandon made his choices. Melissa made hers. They looked at my wife, a woman who loved them both, who'd welcomed Melissa into our family, who'd been nothing but generous and kind. And they decided she was worth less than a beach house in Costa Rica. That's not something a parent can predict or prevent. That's just evil. I'm 70 years old now. Linda is 67. We're still here, still together, still fighting. Maria comes by every day to help. We watch the Diamondbacks together when they're on, even if Linda doesn't always remember the rules anymore. Last night, she held my hand during the 7th-inning stretch and said, "I'm glad you're here, Richard." She knew my name. She knew I was her husband. In that moment, everything else faded away. That's more than Brandon wanted us to have, and it's more than he'll have for the next 28 years. That's the only justice that matters.